Hi everyone, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew. Now this is a short tutorial for sewing a V-neck and attaching a facing. I do have a much longer detailed tutorial that I will link here that goes through a couple of different methods for doing this. If you want to draft a V-neckline on a pattern of your choosing, then please see my V-neckline drafting tutorial and also my facing drafting tutorial if your V-neckline needs a facing. You're going to need to prepare your garment in order to attach the facing. The first thing you will need to do is to stay stitch your neckline or apply some fusible stay tape or interfacing like I have done here on the back and front necklines. If you would like to learn more about this, then please follow the links to the corresponding tutorials. You will need to sew the garment together so that there is a circle around the neckline. You can see that I've sewn the shoulders and I have sewn the centre back seam. If you are working with a fastening in the back, say an invisible zipper, you would also insert that now. It doesn't matter if you choose to sew your side seams together or not at this stage. I've kept them open so that this is nice and clear for you to see. Please note that I'm using black thread so that it shows up clearly. You will also need to prepare your facing pieces. These need to be interfaced on the wrong side with a suitable weight interfacing. They should also be sewn together at the shoulders or any other seams so that you have a circle that needs to attach to the neckline. However, if you have a garment that has a fastening at the centre back, say an invisible zipper, you will not sew the facing together at the centre back. I have another tutorial that shows you how to attach a standard facing, not a V-neck, to a garment with an invisible zipper and how to professionally finish the facing across the top of the invisible zipper. I will link to those here so that you can use them alongside this specific V-neck tutorial. You will also want to finish the outside edge of your facing. I have overlocked this and then turned it under and completed an edge stitch or top stitch very close to the edge. Position your garment with the right side facing up and take your facing. Now the facing piece needs to have the right side facing down, so the right sides of your fabric are together. You're going to match up the shapes of the V, the shoulders and the centre back neck. Pin everything in position and make sure the edges of the fabric are one on top of each other. If you have corresponding seams that need matching, such as the shoulder seams at the facing and at the garment, you will want to start by matching them up yourself. Then take a clover fork pin, position the legs either side of the seam, in and out, and make sure the point of the legs goes towards the raw edge of the fabric and the curved part of the pin is sitting up. Do check that your seams actually match before taking this to the sewing machine. Another tip is how to sew the point of the V. I recommend marking this onto your fabric before sewing. Take a chalk marker or a removable pen and a ruler and measure your seam allowance from the edge of your fabric. Mine is 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimetres on this garment. Continue it past the point of the V. Complete on both sides until both lines match up at the point. I recommend that you draw a line approximately 2 inches, 5 centimetres past the point of the V. Now the facing is pinned onto the neckline, we will go to the sewing machine. The method that I prefer when it comes to sewing V necklines is to start approximately 2 inches, 5 centimetres away from the point of the V. Backstitch, stitch to the V, position the needle in, lift the foot presser foot to move the fabric, and stitch all the way up and back around the neckline until you come back down on top of the stitching that you started, turn at the point of the V again and continue up 2 inches, 5 centimetres, backstitch and stop. This reinforces the point of the V by sewing over it. I talk about other methods of doing this in my longer, more detailed facing and V-neck sewing tutorial. Join me at the sewing machine and we will sew this. We are starting 2 inches, 5 centimetres before the point of the V. Stitch all the way to the point and you can see that I'm removing my pin very gradually here. Stop exactly at the point. Position the needle into the fabric. If you are unsure whether you have gone far enough, lift the presser foot. It looks like I need another stitch, so I will use my hand wheel here to turn it towards me to create another stitch. Or if you've got a single stitch button on your sewing machine, you can do that. When you're happy, we will lift the foot with the needle in the fabric. And we will then turn our fabric and continue stitching up the other side of the V. The corners of the shoulders can be another tricky area for people. Please do draw your stitching lines on if you will find it easier. Keep sewing until you get back to where you started. Trim the threads here if you need to. And then you're going to sew over the original stitching line, back down to the point of the V again. Really accurately here, follow that original stitching line. Position the needle into the same point as before, lift the presser foot and turn the fabric once again. Continue sewing until you are 2 inches 5 centimeters past the point of the V at the other side where you can backstitch. Before going any further, please check that you are happy with the point of your V and that your neckline that you've sewn is symmetrical. You can fold this in half and use a pin to check that it's going through on the same point on both sides. This is useful for checking around the shoulder area too. Using a small pair of scissors, clip straight in to the point of the V, through both layers, the facing and the garment, right up to the stitching, but not through it. You have to be brave here. You do need to clip very close. Press open the seam allowances right up to the point of the neck. So you're pressing the garment on one side and the facing onto the other. Depending on how large your seam allowances are and the thickness of your fabric, you may need to trim, grade, and or clip your seam allowances. If you're unsure how much to grade or trim them down to, I would always recommend taking both seam allowances down to 1/4 inch, 5 millimeters. If the seam allowances are still quite bulky, then do trim your facing seam allowance to 1/8, 2 to 3 millimeters, half the width of the other seam allowance. Clip into any curves to release them using straight snips. I prefer to snip the 2 layers of fabric separately so that I'm not weakening the seam. The final step is to understitch the neckline. We're going to be stitching on the facing, pushing all of the seam allowances towards the facing. We're going to be stitching a 1/16 to an 1/8 away from the seam that joins the facing to the body of the garment, 2 to 3 millimeters. I'm going to be using my edge stitching foot again because I do find it's super easy to get perfect results. I usually begin understitching near the shoulder or centre back seam to prevent the back stitching from being noticed. I'm stitching on the facing. I am pushing the seam allowances towards the facing, both of the seam allowances. And I'm using my edge stitching foot again. The bar of the edge stitching foot is sitting in the crease of the seam that joins the facing to the body. And I've moved my needle over by the amount that I want to make sure that I'm stitching 1/16 to 1/8, 2 to 3 millimeters from this seam. And you're just going to guide this through. Sometimes you need to give the facing a little bit of a pull to make sure that you don't get a pleat in here, ever so slightly. And just work your way around. Again, keep checking underneath that your seam allowances are going in the correct direction. When you get to the point of the V, you're really going to need to pull the fabric away and simply stitch over the point. Try and keep the fabric straight as you're feeding it through, and you should be able to stitch straight over the point of the V. Once the facing has been understitched, press it from the facing side making sure that you can see about 1/8 to 1/16 of the right side of the fabric. So that's 2 to 3 millimeters of the right side of the fabric, so that you can't see the facing from the right side, all the way around. Pull the facing slightly at the bottom of the V when you give it a press to make sure that you get a lovely finish. Again, you want to see a very small amount of the right side of the fabric here, so that you can't see the facing from the right side. To finish the facing, you're going to want to attach it down onto any seam allowances of the garment. These might be shoulder seams, these might be other seams, a centre front seam, a centre back seam, whatever you have. You can do this by hand, completing a figure of 8 tack, or you can do this on the sewing machine. All you're going to need to do is to stitch on the line that you have stitched, finishing the outside edge of your facing. And you're going to need to do that through the seam allowance at the shoulder. I tend to do it at the back seam allowance, but it doesn't matter if you do it on the back or on the front. You only need to do it on one. You're going to want to pin this in place, making sure that you've lined up the shoulders and haven't pulled the facing too much from the neckline or not enough. You want to make sure that you have a nice smooth finish on the right side of the garment. Then join me at the sewing machine and I will show you how to sew this. As I said, the same technique will apply for any other seams you might have. It's a little bit more tricky if the sleeves are in, but it is still possible. Make sure that the garment is out of the way underneath and that you are only going to be stitching through the seam allowance. Start with a tiny forwards and backwards and then stitch along the same line. Make sure that you don't go too far here. Remember, you can't go any further than the seam that joins the shoulders together because you'll be stitching onto the right side of the garment. And there you have a perfectly finished V-neckline with a facing from the right side and from the wrong side or inside of the garment. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you feel more confident sewing V-necklines. Just remember to be accurate with your stitching and you will have a fantastic professional looking V-neckline at the end of it. Thank you for watching and see you soon.